Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Kayla Hillstaub, and I'm the Communications Coordinator at the Digital Democracies Institute. And I'm so pleased to welcome you all today, both in person at our lab and to anybody joining us virtually to the DDI 2023 Summer Speaker Series. We are so thrilled that Dr. Roopa Vasudevan could join us today for our presentation and a discussion. But before we start, let's first acknowledge the territory that the DDI is located on. The unceded and ancestral territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Coquitlam, and Musqueam nations. And being a hybrid event, we might also reflect on the fact that the infrastructure that makes this event possible, such as the servers, cables, towers, and so on, all traverse Indigenous territories far beyond where we are situated on Burnaby Mountain, or the Kwekwetan, as it's known to the Squamish people. With that, I will now introduce our guest, Dr. Roopa Vasudevan. Roopa is a media artist, computer programmer, and scholar based in part of Lenapehoking, known as Philadelphia now. Her work examines social and technological defaults, interrogates rules, conventions, and protocols that we often ignore or take for granted, and centers humanity and community in explorations of technology's impacts on society. She was a member of the Art and Code track at New Inc., the New Museum's Cultural Incubator from 2021 to 2023, and is a Mellon Foundation SFU Artist Fellow on the Data Fluencies Project. She received her PhD from the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania in 2023, and beginning this fall will be an assistant professor in the Department of Art at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Thank you for joining us, everybody, and welcome, Roopa, and over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kayla. So let me share my screen really quickly. And I'll do that and then start my presentation. Okay, can everybody see that? Are we good? Okay, awesome. Thanks everybody. I'm super excited to be here today, and I especially want to thank Kayla and the DDI for inviting me to share my work with you all. For those of you who don't know me already, but I suspect a number of you in the room already do, my name is Roopa, and as Kayla mentioned, I am an artist and scholar who has been working with the DDI since its launch on both the Beyond Verification project and on Data Fluencies, where I'm currently organizing the 2025 Data Fluencies exhibitions. And today I'm going to be presenting high-level creativity, new media art, and the priorities of the tech industry, which I very recently, as in 2 weeks ago, defended as my dissertation project at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. I worked on this project over the course of 4 years, 3 of which spanned a global pandemic. And so it seems like I've been working on this project forever. But in truth, the work also extends longer than that. It deeply engages a community that I have been part of in a very close way for the past 10 years, if not more than that at this point. And so to that end, I begin this presentation on a little bit of a personal note, as my own experiences are what have brought me to this research in the first place. We can think of this as sort of an artist statement to kick things off today. I've been practicing as a self-described new media artist for over a decade now, and I regularly incorporate web technologies, creative coding, automated and manual data collection practices, and experimental digital tools. With my work, I attempt to investigate the technical systems and cultural practices that we've come to see as default in our lives, examining our current systems, behaviors, and interactions, and asking what might have led to where we are now. It was through taking a closer and introspective look at my own art practice, so both the ups and the downs, the places where I felt satisfaction, and those where I experienced trepidation and concern, that I arrived at this project. I've become increasingly aware over time of how tech industry protocols and defaults have actually guided my creative decision-making processes, whether I realized it or not. What I believed to be autonomous creative decisions at the time were actually spurred by which APIs and software development kits I was given access to, how I could maneuver with, around, or against often restrictive terms of service, and mechanisms through which I was permitted to distribute my work. And these constraints and limitations were importantly chafing against my own expectations of myself and my practice. I came to understand that the way that I thought about my work, especially early on in my career, mirrored a perspective that's also espoused by the dominant industry, and maybe even the broader cultural landscape. that artistic uses of technology automatically lead to new enlightenment and expand how we imagine technology's potential. And in general, there's a lot we think that artists can do for society. It's not really an exaggeration to say that we've basically assigned them the power to illuminate things that we can't see, to liberate us from standard ways of thinking, and maybe even to change the world. Media artist Namjoon Paik, who is often seen as one of the forefathers of today's expansive new media art landscape, wrote in 1980 that the artist's job is to think about the future, which is a perspective that holds as true today as it did back then. It's a take that expands into scholarly work on technology and society, and it often makes itself apparent when researchers try to imagine solutions to the bias, hierarchy, and discrimination that we have seen plague our rapidly developing digital systems. Scholars like Ruha Benjamin and Shoshana Zuboff, who both released popular and widely read books on power and technology in 2019, ascribe artists with the ability to come in from the outside to prognosticate, to tell us what we need to do or look out for, or to get us to think in new ways about these thorny problems. And this extends a tradition that goes back decades, compellingly and ominously articulated by media theorist Marshall McLuhan in the 1960s, where he positions art and artists as a warning system for the rest of society. This often can be the case, but in framing it this way, whether intentionally or not, he and those that followed him also positioned the artist as somehow existing independently of the norms and the structures that the rest of us are tied to. But artists are, in reality, also bounded by both the opportunities and limitations inherent to the myriad relationships, dependencies, and material constraints of their chosen media. Scholars like Howard Becker, Pierre Bourdieu, and Dorin Kondo have pointed to these and more in their sociological and anthropological research on artists and art practices. They argue that creativity and inspiration is not divine or sublime. Instead, it's the result of social and economic realities that cause conventions to develop, enable access to some resources over others, and codify and perpetuate broader hierarchies and power dynamics. And so my project extends this approach and perspective to new media artists, who I define in this work as practitioners who see themselves expanding, reinventing, or misusing emerging technology. The project takes the following questions as its guide. So 1, how do the practices and ideologies of the tech industry influence those adopted by new media artists? And 2, how do practitioners navigate the demands, protocols, and expectations that come along with the tools, materials, and industry resources that they use or are expected to use in their work? And I use these questions as starting points for unpacking the complex and involved relationships between artists using digital technologies as primary media for their work and the industry that develops, disseminates, and controls these tools. And at its core, the project attempts to make the case that new media artists are not external to the technology industry at all. Rather, we are deeply and fundamentally embedded within its systems, practices, and ideologies. If we are to fulfill our prescribed role of imagining new possibilities for technology or critiquing it in a meaningful fashion, we must explicitly acknowledge and take this subject position into consideration as we do so. The dissertation itself encompasses 6 chapters, which also structure this presentation. And while today I'll be offering my overview of the project linearly, I've also attempted to write these chapters in such a way that the middle 4, which cover my analysis and findings, might be read interchangeably or independently. The larger project works as a series of entry points into the web of relationships and dependencies that form the new media art field, which offer a multifaceted and holistic perspective on the questions at hand. But before I get into all of that, I want to start by further outlining the practitioner community that I'm engaging with more explicitly and explaining how I arrived at my definition. Building off of Barbie Zellezer's work, I use the model of the interpretive community to both define and sample the artists in this study. The new media art field is expansive and wide-ranging, constantly shifting and evolving, and encompassing a broad and diverse and ever-growing range of tools and materials, spanning web technologies and creative coding, augmented and virtual reality, machine learning and AI, blockchain, and electronics, just to name a handful. Because of this, it's impossible to narrow the genre down by specifics. Instead, I find it more fruitful here to engage the ways in which these practitioners envision their work with technology and how it impacts the way that they see their larger purpose. Theoretically, the project rests on 3 main foundations. I build on theories of scientific and technical infrastructure, art worlds and creative labor, and the imagined affordances that individuals bring to their uses of technological systems. By engaging these frameworks, I argue for a more relational approach to studying the new media art field. Instead of focusing on exemplary artists and art objects as representative of the genre, I take a look at the relationships, workflows, and everyday practices of artists working with new and emerging technology. The project additionally engages with an interdisciplinary body of literature spanning communication, cultural studies, art history and criticism, science and technology studies, and more. In particular, I engage with work on several intersecting themes, including evaluations of the ways that artists are seen as offering enlightenment, renewed perspective, or even liberation, the relationships between art, business, and industry, and the often mutually beneficial nature of these associations, artist and countercultural presence within industrial and research environments that prefigured and continue to permeate the modern day tech industry, as well as its ongoing influence on broader tech culture, the role of art in processes of both urban gentrification and philanthropy, and the habituation and use of technology in daily life, the imaginaries surrounding it, and its relationships to systems of power. And drawing from scholars advocating situated approaches to design and technology, which enable us to examine how everyday decisions are influenced by the demands of capitalism and social power structures, I suggest that new media art and creative technology could benefit from this kind of evaluation as well. I employed a multi-method and multimodal approach to the scholarship, drawing from both established qualitative and interpretive methods, such as interviews and archival research, along with the creative toolkit involving socially engaged workshops, exhibitions, and self-publishing. I also heavily integrate my personal experiences working as an artist through autoethnographic narratives interspersed throughout the dissertation chapters, treating my own experience as something that is worthy of study and using it to augment, counter, or emphasize my other findings. The autoethnographic and creative research elements also led to additional outputs that support the written dissertation, such as the development of new artwork, curatorial and exhibition projects, and the production of a self-published artist book. Throughout, I also link to online documentation of past work, renderings of personal journal entries and anonymized correspondence, and video recordings of talks and lectures that I've given as a way to provide additional modes of experiencing the things that I write about and analyze in the project. So the rest of this presentation offers an overview of the remaining chapters, which is really only pulling the curtain back slightly on the larger work, but which I hope will serve as an introduction to the main arguments and interventions that I'm making. I begin with the chapter framework, which takes a look at the new media artist in the cultural imaginary and traces its origins back to the first art and technology collaborations of the 20th century. I explore archival materials from 3 initiatives that sought to bring avant-garde artists into contact with engineers, computer scientists, and industry. Specifically, I'm looking at Bell Labs Experiments in Art and Technology, or EAT, the original art and technology program at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and Xerox PARC's in-house artist residency. And I put these archives into conversations with documents from contemporary art and technology programs, interviews with artists and cultural workers in the art and tech space, and autoethnographic assessments of my own creative practice. And so by explicitly connecting the dots between the past and the present, I argue that the early integration of artists into industrial settings and collaborations set the stage for today's understandings of who the new media artist is, what they're supposed to be doing, and the cultural goals and desired impacts of their work. In particular, artists are consistently seen to offer new visions for technology, which echoes one of the primary motivations behind the original art and technology initiatives. As EAT co-founder Billy Kluver outlines in many documents throughout the archive, artists have consistently been seen as an untapped intelligence resource that offer promising and expansive ideas for uses of technology that extend beyond what scientists and engineers are able to come up with on their own. This perspective has long continued on the industrial side, but importantly, it also shapes the way that new media artists see themselves in the present moment. They view their cultural role as opening up new possibilities for technology and digital systems beyond the more standard functions prescribed by the mainstream industry. And they often view novelty as a key indicator that they are successful in their practices. Over and over, artists told me about wanting to use technology in ways that were unexpected, unprescribed, or against intention, encouraging unorthodox applications of these systems that will lead to new or more expansive understandings of them. We can see that even though the goals of each group are ostensibly different, they see the key roles and responsibilities of the new media artist in essentially identical ways. Excuse me. Artists also see themselves as distinctly different from traditional engineers and computer scientists, perpetuating a dichotomy that persists from the early days of the initial collaborations. This boundary often led to friction and misunderstanding between the two camps in those early initiatives, stemming from preconceived ideas of what each group was supposed to be doing. Artists were responsible for imagining the impossible, and the engineers were the ones who actually made it happen. And although today's new media artists are, on the whole, much more technically proficient than their 20th century counterparts, we can still see a clear distinction between what artists are supposed to be doing and what is done by more traditional tech workers. Artists view these more standard roles as too restricting, even though they may also fill them in both creative and work capacities. They often told me that in their creative practices, they needed space and flexibility to change or break rules as they see fit, which they saw as completely different from what a traditional engineer or programmer would do or be allowed to do. Tension or friction often emerged when thinking about the ways that artist work is perceived by those who are experiencing it. In the early initiatives, this is most directly visible when industrial partners had different ideas about the type of work that should emerge from the collaborations. But this dissonance also extends to today, when, as many artists told me, audiences attempt to reduce work down to the technologies used to create it, or try to figure out or suggest marketable consumer products or tools that could be developed from an art piece. This again perpetuates the notion of art as offering a starting point for innovation, and a prevalent assumption that digital technology needs to be connected to practical use in some way. Artists also reported feeling pressure to keep up with technological hype, staying, as tech research firm Gartner calls it, at the peak of inflated expectations of new tech tools and systems. This serves as a creative strategy for artists to continually position themselves at the cutting edge, guaranteeing that their work aligns with what is generating the most buzz at any given moment. This may often involve catering to the tech press and to social media, creating work with a wow factor that is capable of making a big splash among curators, industry professionals, audiences, and avid tech consumers alike, or, as we'll see more in the next chapter, feeling as though one has to stay on top of all of the latest trends, tools, and jargon in order to be seen as a legitimate participant in this space. In so many ways, artists internalize feeling responsible for pushing boundaries and leading the rest of the world towards new and better technology, even as they may not outwardly or consciously consider their practices to be doing so. Here, Christopher Clary told me that he often feels uncomfortable with the responsibility for broad social change that is placed on his shoulders as an artist working with emerging media. Artists in this space are frequently siphoned into a very specific role of predicting the future and leading us in new directions, which sometimes might be at odds with the reason that we actually got into creative work in the first place. The third chapter, Syntax, examines the everyday practices of new media artists. So here I outline the constant uncertainty and crisis that underpins creative practices using technology, and argue that this informs the move fast and break things mentality that many artists adopt in relation to their work. In dialogue with Howard Becker and his notion of the genre convention in artistic practice, and the ways he argues these conventions can be broken, I suggest that the power to break convention in new media art is actually shifted from individual artists to the tech industry. Becker's genre convention assumes a stable and consistent set of rules for how art practice is supposed to operate. But as Wendy Chun outlines, contemporary technology is premised on a series of crises, necessitating frequent updates and compliance from users in order to remain at stasis. Instead of an expression of autonomy, as Becker saw it, the broken convention in new media art becomes an engineered crisis that has to be mitigated by keeping pace with technical, corporate, and industrial dictates. Accordingly, training focused on the idea of impermanence in new media art reveals it to be a primary default setting and a guiding force that shapes almost everything these artists do. The artists I interviewed all shared anecdotes, frustrations, and major choices that they've had to make in their practices, relating to technological speed, software and hardware components breaking, workflow shifting with the introduction of new tools or technical frameworks, or crucial specifications needing to be updated. Sometimes this means fixing things while a work is actively being experienced. Sometimes it means adjusting or changing how a viewer engages or interacts with an artwork. And often it reflects deep concerns about the preservation of tech-based artworks, even those that don't outwardly seem as such. All of this leads to larger affective consequences. There's often a constant anxiety that follows artists through their practices because they can never be totally sure of how long a work is going to survive without active care and maintenance. One of the more frustrating aspects of this impermanence is when platforms, web services, or companies update their technology in ways that cause new errors, incompatibility, or even total malfunction in existing work. What seem like routine system updates on the company end can cause an artwork that was working perfectly well one day to totally break the next. And artists are often taken by surprise when this happens, and they struggle to update their work to comply with new requirements. Other issues emerge when platforms remove or disable key features that may have been integral to a project as originally envisioned. This causes artists to have to make big decisions about whether or not to rebuild their work using different systems. Even when artists do take the time to reconstruct their projects, the impossibility of fully replicating the look, feel, or functionality of a consumer product or platform can cause the work to change dramatically from its original version. Artists take it as a given that the longevity of their work can never be guaranteed. Instead, many of them think of their projects as existing in a more ephemeral manner, where the permanence of any one material, tool, or system is an impossibility. And they operate from this perspective as a starting point, whether that's considering the work as having a lifespan of sorts or keeping the idea of obsolescence in mind as they build their projects. This also influences notions of thinking of a work as finished or completed. Artists often claim to have made peace with the idea that their work was going to die eventually, but in other instances, as artist Woody Sullender demonstrates here, they start thinking about their works in terms of what author and tech evangelist Tim O'Reilly has termed the perpetual beta, where there's a constant process of iteration, updating, and refinement that comes along with creating a tech-based piece. This perspective also leads in part to a fundamental assumption that never-ending education, learning, or tinkering underpins creative work with technology. In addition to updating individual works, artists perpetually update their practices to keep up with larger mandates from both industry and the cultural imaginary around digital systems. Interviewees repeatedly spoke to me about feeling compelled to refresh or add to their creative toolkits, often framing this need as core to new media art practice as a whole. At times, they told me they might design an entire project around a desire to learn a system that they think they should know, or that they're curious to experiment with. Even in light of the frustrations that proprietary tools cause, tech-based artists find it very difficult to stay away from them. Artists often told me that they believe in open source ideals and would love to only use open technologies in their work, but when it comes time to actually producing, it becomes very difficult to do so. For many, proprietary or corporate technologies offer convenience, ease of use, and a promise of reliability that many of the open source counterparts simply can't, although there are definitely exceptions to this rule. And there is also a much steeper learning curve in both implementing and maintaining open source technologies, which the use of proprietary tech flattens substantially for both artists and their potential audiences. All of this uncertainty and precarity leads artists to view their practices in myopic and presentist ways. We tend to think of workflows and finished projects in similar ways to consumer technology. When the old device breaks, it's time for an upgrade. And when the old artwork stops being easy to maintain, we leave it behind in favor of working on something more relevant. And as we've seen, there's also much more of an incentive to move on to the next big thing rather than continually revisiting and rebuilding broken work. This causes the conventions in new media art practice to bend and break with the rapid evolution of technology, rather than as the prerogative of individual artists working with digital systems. Chapter 4, Handshake, returns to the idea of direct artist-industry collaboration, but this time examining the present day. This chapter takes a look at both the proliferation of in-house residencies and arts initiatives within the contemporary tech industry, as well as the ways that new media artists' day jobs foster these connections. As with the rest of this project, I'm not so much interested here in work produced as part of these initiatives, although questions about output certainly do come into play. But I focus more on the artist experience, how they make the decision to participate in these collaborations, what they expect of the process and what is expected of them, and the ways participation in these spaces affects their understandings of the ethics surrounding their own practices. In this chapter, I developed the concept of digital art washing to refer to the perceived use of art and artists to promote, normalize, or enhance the cultural value of the technology industry. Building on literature discussing art washing processes in urban gentrification and philanthropy, I argue that the strategic use of art by tech companies serves to at once legitimize new consumer tech while offering insight into how these technologies might be used for entertainment, aesthetics, emotion, or other purposes extending past pure functionality. And as an example of what this looks like, I point to the 2010 project, The Wilderness Downtown, which was developed by Google Creative Lab in collaboration with filmmaker Chris Milk and the indie rock band Arcade Fire. The work is a prominent example of a project that was hailed for its creativity and innovation in interactive storytelling, while also serving as a promotion for the technical capabilities of the then brand new Google Chrome web browser, which 13 years later now holds 65% of the browser market share. And using proprietary tools in creative practice and collaborating with corporations to make creative work is not necessarily undesirable in and of itself. But I draw the connection to art washing here to emphasize the artificial enclosure that these strategies build around specific technologies as inevitable or the only option for doing this or similar work. Building on Jessa Lingel's conception of the gentrification of the internet, I suggest here that digital art washing, much like its analog counterpart, supports the processes of commercialization, isolation, and displacement that end up narrowing the range of accepted behaviors and interactions in online and digital space. And importantly, artists are often on the fence about participating in these initiatives because of what they themselves see as processes of art washing. To many of the practitioners I spoke to, even those who have repeatedly worked with large companies, fears of their work being used as advertisements or in marketing colors the way that they consider opportunities to participate and often makes them hesitant to do so. There were also issues surrounding creative control and intellectual property, where artists felt uneasy about whether or not they would be able to retain ownership of a work once a collaboration or program ended. And these fears do have merit. So here, artist Stephen outlines the restrictive terms of one of his residencies, which essentially locked him out of any independent oversight of the project he developed as part of it. Ultimately, though, artists also saw a lot of benefits to participating in industrial or corporate initiatives. Sometimes they were convinced to take part because of their trust of artists who had previously been involved. Sometimes it was about the money or the wide promotion and reach that they thought would come along with participation. And sometimes it was about the benefits they saw for their practices in the long run, whether through inspiration and creative direction or simply bolstering one's CV. Artists often go into these initiatives or even look at them from afar with preconceived ideas about what would be expected of them, work that makes the company look good and upholds the digital art washing paradigm. Some also told me that they ended up abandoning their initial ideas or refocusing on projects that were less political or controversial in order to adhere to the desires of the industrial partner, both real and imagined. Other artists told me that the project that they pitched were things that they wouldn't necessarily have done on their own, using technologies that they wouldn't ordinarily work with. This was done as a concession to the parameters of the opportunity or to play to things that the company was interested in supporting. Some spoke of a process of attempting to figure out what was expected of them and then adjusting their own plans to align with the perceived goal of the initiative. And even with these adjusted expectations, artists did often report feeling additionally let down by the realities of participating in company arts programs. While this definitely wasn't universal, and some artists did report feeling support and investment in their specific experiences, others told me that what they went in expecting wasn't necessarily delivered as promised. Several interviewees were confused by the lack of external promotion for their projects when the supposed reach entailed by working with a tech company was a big selling point for them initially. And some reported disappointment with the tools and the resources that they actually had access to for their own project development. Some told me also that it wasn't clear what the goals actually were of having artists in the industrial or research space. In some instances, artists were expected to fit into a prescribed role that differed dramatically from what they were envisioning, while in Others, it seemed unclear as to how exactly the artist would fit into the environment at all. This calls back to the tension between the preconceived role of the artist and that of the engineer, which has been a mainstay in many of these collaborations since the earliest initiatives. And the last thing I want to bring up in this chapter is that when I asked artists about collaborations with big companies, many of them interpreted this as day jobs, freelancing, or other forms of tech work that they do to support themselves financially. This points to the fact that today's new media artists possess skills that are highly desirable and transferable to a wide range of jobs within the tech sector and beyond. And direct overlaps with the larger industry are not limited to specific arts-focused initiatives. Artists or creative perspectives are often seen as highly valuable within what can be considered more standard tech work. And artists may use these experiences to directly support their creative practices, whether that's as a source of funding or as creative inspiration. The last main chapter, Exception, offers an examination of creative resistance and agency within new media art practice. Drawing from 9 socially engaged artistic workshops I led with over 70 artists and cultural workers between 2020 and 2022, I demonstrate that new media artists already feel tensions with the tech industry in our work, even as we may not openly discuss them. I therefore ask new media artists to envision ourselves and our capacities for agency and refusal as beginning from a deeply embedded subject position. When we think about resistance enacted through artwork, we often imagine activism or political engagement. Indeed, many new media artists self-define as making political, critical, or activist work. But this is far from universal, and many artists envision their practice as expanding the boundaries of what is possible within technical systems, or offering new ways of conceiving uses for existing technology. But as I've already argued, new media artists fundamentally see themselves as bucking the status quo by expanding, reinventing, or misusing technological systems. And so creative resistance, in my reading of and engagement with the idea within these practices, also considers how artists seek to implicitly refuse or critique the constraints of mainstream technology by attempting to build on top of, alongside, or instead of it. In 2020, I started leading workshops on creative resistance in technology for artists who saw themselves as exploring new media in their work. The workshops incorporate free writing, small group discussion, and drafting a collective manifesto based around the 7 prompts you see here, which ask participants to think about where we see ourselves tied up in systems we don't want to be a part of, and what the routes for agency are once we realize how connected we are to the mainstream industry. The intimate nature of the workshops opened up honest discussions about the fears and trepidation that artists have with their current modes of practice. Some spoke of power dynamics and getting lost in them, as with this participant who worried about platforms, apps, and services eating them up and using them. Similarly, others were concerned about the exploitation of artists and artwork. As this participant noted, and as my research outlines, there is a long history of artists being seen as a mechanism in the industry to make technology more palatable to general audiences. Another participant pointed to the idea of artists being used as free research and development within the industry, and the power differentials that prevent artists from making tools that align more to their own values. And some pointed to questions of accessibility within new technology and questioned who is actually able to see and engage with the work that we make. When asked about what they desire and want in their practices, artists overwhelmingly pointed to a slower and more measured pace, both with technology and with the new media art field. While they feel pressured to move fast and break things, the speed of technological advancement often comes into conflict with what artists feel would actually be more beneficial to their practices. Artists wanted time to process and digest their interactions with digital systems, and to not be rushed into churning out new work on such short, compressed timescales. This also extended to re-envisioning the intrinsic learning in new media art practice as something contributing to a more meaningful outcome, rather than just chasing the next big thing. Many participants spoke of wanting more time to process the lineages they're building on top of in their work, and to deeply explore different approaches to thinking about technology rather than the standard story of perpetual and escalating disruption and innovation. Many artists also pointed to the perceived complicity and self-justification inherent to the field, because these things are necessary to continue to produce work in the current model. Even though they don't want to continue using these tools and systems, they feel as though their hands are tied. Over and over, they question where the avenues are for doing something different, especially if we accept that we're fundamentally caught up in these systems at the ground level. To answer that question, I began developing additional projects stemming from the workshop, which have developed into a larger cultural organizing project that continues into the present. These exhibition, public art, and publishing components incorporate the manifestos from each workshop that I ran, and I additionally offered opportunities to former workshop participants to develop new writing and artwork in connection with the broader themes and ideas. Central to this work is the idea of community care. So it's my goal with this research as a whole to provide a dedicated space for tech-based artists to come together to openly and honestly discuss our larger ties to industry and power. We're given very few opportunities to do so in our everyday practices, even though it's something that many of us clearly feel and often struggle with. And I hope that this research can provide the first step to larger solidarity. To close, I just want to offer a few thoughts. Like I said before, this presentation has really only begun to scratch the surface of my findings. New media artists' relationships with the tech industry encompass some really complex, involved ties that the written dissertation dives much deeper into, while incorporating many more voices than I was able to include here. But ultimately, the project makes the case for us to explicitly acknowledge these connections up front, rather than pretending that artists occupy a mythical space floating outside of these dynamics. Doing so limits us from seeing the ways that new media artists draw our sense of self and cultural relevance from tech industry priorities, and obscures how everyday practices we take for granted may perpetuate technical norms and defaults that we may not necessarily want to ascribe to. These connections, in turn, also have implications for wider creative and intellectual production when workflows, preservation and storage, processes of ideation, and even notions of cultural impact depend so greatly on the decisions of an increasingly small number of major corporations. And I want to stress that I do not want to take away from the power of art and artists to make change, inspire action, and capture people's hearts and minds. But following Donna Haraway and a broader feminist tradition of examining power and society in an unflinching manner, my research argues that until we are aware of how we are situated in relation to these structures, there's no way that we can take stock of all the possibilities for agency and change that we might have at our disposal. Rather than disavowing our connections to industry, maybe fully accepting them might actually show us where to go next. And so with that, thank you all so much again for being here today and listening. And I'm super looking forward to continuing the conversation with you all.
Thank you so much, Roopa, for that fascinating presentation and sharing this wonderful project with us. We have a lot of time here for discussion, so maybe we can open it up to questions. If anybody, Anthony, would like to start.
Anyway, I'm the officially designated respondent, which is nice because I'm behind that. Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Where? Oh, it took me like 20 minutes to understand the puns with like the different sections, but I really like that. I just wanted to say that's great. Also, yeah, for me, like I'm working on this right now, that was really useful, like structurally, to hear how you organize that. So thanks for that.
Oh, good. I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah.
It was like a pun that made a lot of sense to me of where I'm at in my life, which was nice. Anyway, actual question. I guess I have two, and you can pick one. First was like, it seemed I liked it. I like how it sort of kind of seems like it's focused on your work, sort of focused on like the idea of selling out in a way, and this idea of, and then like the intersection with open source and like the idea of ownership. Like it made me think of like Google employees getting like the 20% of time or whatever, but then Google owns the code. And yeah, I think. Yeah, I was curious, just thinking like if anyone talked about or like you have thoughts on that as like a sort of political economic model, like in this sort of interesting interplay with open source like work in that regard. Obviously, too, because like companies like Red Hat or something like that, or like Canonical, are like built on like making open source software. So that's question one. And yeah, just pick one, because if other people have questions, take time. Question two is, actually, no, it's too close to question one. So I have question one.
Well, question one is actually a really easy thing for me to answer because actually back in 2021, I published a paper in New Media and Society about this very thing.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I'll send you the link by email.
Cool.
But it's a really persistent question, especially because a lot of the community, the practitioners that I spoke to, a really large subset of them do work in open source creative technology. A lot of them contribute to code bases. A lot of them work on open source projects like processing, P5.js, open frameworks, like all of these things that really build on the open source model and really believe on this idea of free and accessible software. And I think, a lot of them, like I mentioned, when I was talking about chapter 3, a lot of them really, I think, take to heart that political statement of, technology should be accessible to everybody. It should be open to everybody. But when the chips are down, sometimes it's easier to make a project with proprietary tools, right? Like sometimes it's just easier to use TensorFlow than it is to mount your own GPU and kind of build your own machine learning library and like doing all of these things when you can just plug in something that a big company has already done for you and your project will get done that much quicker, especially if you're on a deadline for an exhibition or there's somebody kind of breathing down your neck to get something done. And so I think a lot of these artists, while they really ascribe to open source politics and really believe in it, myself included, like I've done a lot of work with these communities and I've been involved with them since I was in art school. Sometimes it's just easier to incorporate the proprietary tools. Sometimes it's just easier to use what Google or Meta build for you. Really thinking practically about the projects that you're making. And so there's a tension between these artists who really want to promote open source and want to politically align with it versus the realities of operating on the compressed timescales that are expected of us and kind of at the speed that tech-based artists are really like kind of expected to operate at, which don't necessarily align with artists who are working more static forms, right? You're never really like pressuring a painter or a sculptor to get something done in a 3-month turnaround. That just is like unheard of and it wouldn't happen. And so I think that tension is fundamentally like, sometimes artists kind of go for these tools or incorporate these technologies and kind of work with these big companies when they would rather not, just because practically it's really the only way to get it done.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. Yeah, I mean, it even reminds me, I remember when I was like trying to pick a JavaScript framework to learn, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna go with Vue because it's like good politics. And I'm just like, oh, React works with my brain so much better. And I've carried this like sinfulness in me because I know React and not Vue. Like, anyways, yeah, thanks. That was super interesting. And
yeah, I'll send that to you.
I'll just don't worry about it.
Okay, thank you. Is there another question? Alberto, I was going to say Anthony again. Alberto.
Yeah. Well, first of all, hi, Alberto here.
Hi, Alberto, how are you?
Okay, well, Dr. Vasudevan, first of all, congratulations for defending and good luck for your next step in your professional career. I was curious as you were talking about what I perceived as a tension, but maybe it's not, between artists' desire to learn new tools and skills and also engage in projects as a way to learn new technology, but also their desire to stay on surface of these technologies to avoid being sucked into a certain technological perspective. So yeah, if we can talk more about their how they navigate this. First of all, if there's any tension, and then if there's any strategy they use to navigate it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, and yeah, I absolutely think it's a tension. I heard, particularly in the workshops, I heard from a lot of artists who would rather just spend a lot of time really getting, again, going back to painting and sculpture, you have these artists in more static, traditional studio practices who spend years, decades just mastering one particular aspect of their craft, right? They master like the representation or perspective or something, but they have the time to really dig into a very minute kind of aspect of the tool, the medium that they're working with, without worrying that everything is just going to change and be upended at the last minute. And new media artists do not have this luxury. You know, you spend all of this time learning a framework, learning a programming language. I think what Anthony pointed out with this idea of like feeling like, oh, you should learn React, you should learn certain frameworks, you should learn this. I already know JavaScript, but I need to kind of learn it in this capacity in order to stay on top of what's trendy and new and incorporate into that work. And so as a result, artists don't have the luxury of getting really, really, really good at something, of feeling like they have mastered a tool, know its ins and outs, kind of really fundamentally understand and embrace it and feel like they know it kind of backwards and forwards. Really, a lot of the participants that I interviewed, including myself, we all think of ourselves as hackers. We all think of ourselves as really kind of only really grasping the surface level of a tool to the point where it makes sense for the work before having to drop it and move on to the next thing in order to stay relevant. And often that kind of sense of relevance and perpetual and, you know, kind of maintaining that sense of relevance kind of rests on this idea of perpetually learning the new thing, of gravitating to the next thing, of picking up the next tool. This is what you saw when NFTs became a thing back in 2021. You saw all of these digital artists, some of whom I really respected for their critical approaches to previous technologies, all of a sudden losing the criticality and hopping on the NFT bandwagon because they didn't want to be left behind the curve. They didn't want to be seen as kind of the Luddite or the fuddy-duddy who was kind of dragging their feet while this thing became this new trendy thing that they could then kind of take advantage of creatively and really kind of maintain their practice on top of. And you're seeing it now, particularly with generative AI, image generation software like DALL-E and Midjourney and Stable Diffusion. I write in one of my narratives in my dissertation about kind of feeling pressured to like use these tools and systems, which I've done in a couple of projects now, as a way of kind of making my work speak to the contemporary conversation that is happening around new technology. And so as far as like strategies and best practices, a lot of artists really cope with this by kind of framing their practices. You know, being a new media artist at its core is essentially the process of learning new technology. One of my artists, who I think I quoted in the presentation, you know, told me that she thought it was a scam when people told her that working in this field was essentially just constantly learning new software. But ultimately, that's kind of what you have to forefront and focus on in your practice if you are going to stay relevant and if you're going to continue to get your work shown and not be seen as obsolete or falling behind the times. And so I think that's the way that artists have really chosen to cope with it, is kind of centering that process of learning as part of their creative process, so that then they're never caught off guard when there's something new that they have to implement in their work. They can just kind of use the strategies that they've used to learn new things, to learn the new technology, to create a work that incorporates it and kind of stay up and keep up with the times.
Thank you. Come back here. I don't know. Thanks so much. Very, very interesting.
Okay, are there other questions? Okay, Amy.
Hello, Roopa. I have a question, not so much about the technology side, but more about the art side. And from some of the work that I've been doing, I'm interested in sort of some of the things you talk about around what I'm sort of hesitate to call cultural appropriation or like artistic appropriation by the companies that are engaging these artists, because it made me think of one of the projects that I've heard about through the course of my work, where it's arts at CERN, where the Hadron Collider place is employing artists to work with scientists to kind of try and help scientists think differently about some of their work, which I think is a really interesting concept, but also it's more like now the art is being, or the artist is being used as a tool to try and, you know, kind of like develop the scientists to try and think about their questions differently or something like that. So it's more, I think that's kind of my question, is kind of like how do artists then, I guess, kind of either deal with or adapt to like the drive being from not themselves, I suppose, or how do they adapt where there are like restrictions on their work because of contractual obligations and things like that?
Yeah, that's a really terrific question. Have you come across Black Quantum Futurism's work in that program? I think they participated in that residency.
No.
But They, I just recently heard they're a Philly-based collective that has been doing work with CERN, and I think has kind of been part of that program. So yeah, well, we can talk in July when I see you in person. But the simple answer to that is a lot of them compartmentalize, right? A lot of them don't think of these projects that they're doing for these companies as core to their artistic practices. I had one artist who has participated in a lot of residencies with Adobe specifically. He's done several projects with Adobe. So there was one augmented reality residency that he did. And then he had a couple of commissions that Adobe made of him of new projects that were building off of previous work that he had done. But that he told me, he said that he doesn't think of it as following the same model as the work that he would show in the gallery or in his personal practice. Instead, the things that he makes with Adobe are lighter, they're much more graphic, they're much more playful, they're kind of adhering to the image that Adobe wants to put out into the world. And the reason that he's doing it is it's a chance to experiment with all of this new kind of not public technology for augmented reality that Adobe is developing, but then also they pay really well, right? They give you a salary in this residency, they give you benefits for a year, they kind of treat you like an employee. And it's a way to get yourself on stable footing in a creative field that, at least in the United States, that is sorely lacking in all kinds of public support for the arts, right? So taking part in these residencies is a way for artists to kind of, get some kind of financial solvency, some financial stability, maybe working with technologies that they're curious about. I have an artist that I spoke to who recently was working with OpenAI on something, and I spoke to her about after I had done the research for this project, but I might talk to her further as the project gets developed into a book. But she was talking to me about, this tension that she's feeling. She's like, yeah, I would love to kind of poke under the hood and use the things that OpenAI is developing that is not commercially available, that people can't just log onto the internet and use like they can with DALL-E. At the same time, I have to be careful about not making the critical work or the really subversive work that I would normally make. Because OpenAI is involved so heavily in this project, I have to be really careful about kind of what I'm doing or kind of the things that I'm building with this new technology or with the technology that I have access to. I had an artist tell me that he thinks about the work that he does with these companies as more consulting or about kind of like existing on the periphery of his creative practice, where it's informing the things that he is doing in his personal practice and the things that he's showing in more fine art contexts, but it's not actually that work. Like the stuff that he does for corporate entities like Samsung and Spotify are very different from the things that he would like show in a museum or like work with a curator to put into a show. And so they kind of, separate that a little bit. Even as they inform each other, they kind of think of that work as existing in a separate plane from what they're really creatively invested in, so that they don't get too bogged down in like the ownership and the fact that they may not have intellectual control over it, or the fact that it's kind of serving as an advertisement or as marketing for a company. If they don't think of it as something that is really deeply informed by their practice, there's less of a tension there, and then they can justify making that work and building it for these institutions.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Looks like we have time maybe for one more question. There's one more. Adana, yes, please.
Hi, Roopa. This was so fascinating. And thank you so much for sharing it. I'm looking forward to talking with you more when we see each other in a few weeks.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to ask you to say more about ephemerality and new media projects, because, as I was listening to your presentation, I was just like, man, it's such a bummer to, even as you're building a project, know that like in 2 or 3 years, people might not ever be able to even see this, right? Like the infrastructure that the project depends on may change so radically or entirely disappear that it's not going to be, visible. And that honestly sounds like a huge bummer. And I'm curious to know like how the folks in your project kind of deal with that problem.
Yeah, it's hard. It's like, and I think a lot of us self-justify. A lot of us have come to, and I say us because I'm including myself in this, right?
Of course, yeah.
This is the way that I've come to think about my own work as well. A lot of us kind of assume, go into a project knowing that it's not going to be around forever, accepting that as the foundational baseline, and drawing from other practices that incorporate some kind of ephemerality, Performance art is a big one that got referenced a lot. Also, land art is a big one where you can't control the ravages of nature on a project that you are building out in the open. And so you just kind of have to accept that whatever happens to it, right? But a lot of artists talked about performance art specifically in terms of making sure you have good documentation and thinking about the documentation as kind of containing the heart of the project, making sure that you get photos, videos, screen recordings, screenshots, anything that is evidence of your project working in the moment that it was working. In my dissertation, I talk about a project that I built, a net art project that I built in 2012 that went down for a period of time in 2021 and 2022. My attempts to resurrect it and my frustration with myself that I did not capture good documentation of it at the time. I didn't capture a screen recording of the interaction. I had two like really grainy screenshots that I couldn't put on my portfolio. And so thinking about, you know, making sure that you do as much as possible to preserve the work in the moment that it's functional, that can then, very similar to the performance art, kind of be used in exhibition context as kind of evidence of like, oh, this work is not necessarily alive now, but this is what it was doing, and this is why it was important, and these are the interactions that kind of spurred in people. This kind of you know, you're starting to see a little bit of a shift. And, you know, something that I didn't mention in the presentation is I do engage somewhat with the literature in museum preservation and conservation studies about preserving new media art, because this is a frantic conversation that is happening among those folks, particularly people in larger institutions and museums who are kind of scrambling to figure out, you know, they're collecting so much new media artwork that they think is important at the time, and just knowing that it's not going to be functional in its original capacity in a couple of years really freaks people out. So thinking about ways to kind of preserve or document it, you're starting to see a little bit of a shift in that literature about kind of thinking about documentation, which is a departure because up until now, a lot of folks have relied on things like emulators, rebuilding the project, sourcing materials that could resemble the way that things were constructed back in the day, right? This is a question particularly around Namjoon Paik's work, who's using a lot of obsolete TVs, obsolete electronic equipment. And so it's like a conversation among these conservationists about how to maintain this work, how to upgrade systems when this equipment dies. And it kind of carries into the way that net art or new media art is kind of preserved in the current moment. But the shift towards documentation, I think, that's happening in this literature also kind of uses the documentation as a way to potentially rebuild the piece down the line, right? Oh, we can use the documentation to kind of resurrect the piece if we need to. Whereas the artists are really thinking about it as the documentation is the work, right? That is the thing that is going to persist into the future, or at least a longer period of time than the actual work itself. And so we need to start treating the documentation as this relic of the work as functional, and kind of forget this idea of ever rebuilding it because the work's going to die. You need to make sure that you capture evidence of it being active in the moment that it was active. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question entirely, but yeah.
Yeah, for sure. No, I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's probably a good time to pause for now, but I'm sure we'll pick up the conversation in July when you're here, Roopa. So thanks again for joining us. Maybe one more big thank you from us.
Thank you all so much for having me. This was great.
And next week, we have Judy Radul joining us from SFU, from the School for the Contemporary Arts. So we hope to see you all again next week.
Bye, Roopa.
Bye, Roopa.
Bye. Thank you all so much.